Welcome to this introduction to using special collections and archives in your research. In this session we will be looking at what special collections are and what the advantages are of using them in your research. I'll also talk briefly about some points you need to consider when you're using primary source materials. We'll look at a selection of the collections we hold at Essex and then talk about what you can do to search for collections outside the university. Finally, we will give you some advice on how to plan your visit to collections. Firstly then, what are special collections? Special collections are made up of materials that are stored under controlled conditions and with limited access for some or all of the reasons that follow. The materials might be very rare. They might be very old or otherwise in poor physical condition. They might be in a format that's difficult to store in the normal library setting. And finally, it might be a condition laid down by the person who donated the materials that they be stored separately and with limited access. So now we know what special collections are, why might you want to use them? There's good potential for original research. Some collections haven't been used much by other researchers, so you have the opportunity to break new ground. Collections will cover a range of subjects and time periods from the historical to the modern. And many collections contain primary source materials. Access to collections has improved greatly over the last few years with online finding aids and digitised materials. Support is available when you use collections, not only from lecturers but from library and archive staff. And finally, it's important to remember that special collections are for everyone. Special collections often contain primary sources. You may be familiar with the idea of what a primary source is, but just in case, here's a quick reminder. Primary sources are materials created by the people or during the time period being studied. There's a huge variety of materials that count as primary sources. Some of them you might expect, like artworks, diaries and manuscripts, but primary sources can also include things like data and news reports. Using primary sources will benefit your research as it allows you to access original materials without the filter of criticism and interpretation by other authors. When you're using materials from primary sources, there are some things you should consider. Firstly, authenticity. Is the material what it appears to be? Next, you should consider the possibility of bias. Was the material you're looking at created to give a misleadingly negative or positive view of a person or group of people? This is connected to the next point, the historical social context. If you're looking at a government publication, for example, did that government actively discriminate against groups within the population? If they did, it's likely to be reflected in their publications. The next point is to consider the physical object you're looking at. Was an early printed book bound in leather with gilding to appeal to rich collectors, or was it produced in a cheap edition to ensure quick sales and wide distribution? Did an artist make drawings in a sketchbook, or did they scribble on the back of an envelope? How does a writer's handwriting change between formal and informal documents? Considering the materiality of an object as well as its content will give you important insights that aren't provided by the content alone. When you're using primary sources, particularly if you're going to quote from those materials in your work, you need to consider both confidentiality and copyright. For example, people who have participated in sociological studies will have given consent for a certain amount of information to be used for the purposes of the study, but that consent may not extend beyond the study itself. If you're looking at letters or other personal papers, you may need to check that the person who wrote them, or their descendants, are happy for them to be referenced or reproduced. If you have any questions about confidentiality or the ownership of the copyright of the materials you're using, check with staff who will be able to advise you. Now we'll have a look at a selection of the materials we have in the library to give you an idea of what sort of content our special collections cover. A quick overview. The library holds more than 70 individual collections. They cover a variety of subject areas and time periods and are local, national and international in scope. We are a library, but our collections don't just contain books. Some collections include artworks, diaries, manuscripts or objects that belong to the subject of the collection, like sunglasses, awards and even binoculars. Now to have a look at some of the collections. It's not a surprise that the library is home to the University of Essex collection. This is an archive of the university from its first foundation and includes policy and committee papers, prospectuses, course guides, student publications and press cuttings, as well as several boxes of photographs. There's also a section dedicated to the student protests and unrests of the late 1960s and early 1970s. The University Photo Archive has been digitised and is available on Flickr. The HARSNETT collection is formed of the library of Samuel HARSNETT, a Colchester clergyman who was Archbishop of York from 1629 to 1631. As you might expect, most of the works in this collection are on the subject of religion, but there are also works on geography, travel and science. A large part of the collection consists of tracts, short publications that would have been sold or distributed individually, which have been bound into volumes. J. A. Baker, ornithologist and nature writer, is best known for his book The Peregrine, first published in 1967, in which he recorded his observations of the bird life of East Anglia and drew attention to the fact that many species were at risk of extinction. The book is a landmark in nature writing and has been reissued several times. The archive we hold in the library contains notebooks, maps, letters and diaries, as well as optical artefacts, including binoculars used by Baker in the field. The GAUDIER BRZESKA archive relates to the life of artist and sculptor Henri GAUDIER BRZESKA and his partner Sophie, a writer. The archive contains letters from Henri to Sophie, many of which are illustrated and which were written during his time in the army during the First World War, until he was killed in action in 1915. The archive also includes Sophie's diary and some of her unpublished writings. The National Social Policy and Social Change Archive, known as Qualidata, is a collection of original research data relating to studies undertaken by a number of sociologists, including Paul Thompson's study Family Life and Work Experience before 1918, and Jan Pahl's study of domestic violence and women's refuges. The collections include original research questionnaires and notes made by the researchers. A collection that was deposited at the library relatively recently, the World War I Community Centenary Collection, contains materials created by community groups to mark the 100 years anniversary of the 1914-18 war. The commemorative projects were supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and took many forms, from books and exhibitions to community operas and plays. Many of the groups chose to focus on stories and contributions from members of the community that had been previously neglected or overlooked by other official histories. As well as the physical collections of archives and printed books, the library can offer you access to a large number of online resources that provides access to digitised archive content. We'll look at some of these now. As with our special collections, this is just a selection. There are many more resources available through our website. One example of the kind of source that has good online coverage is news media. We have access to ProQuest historical newspapers and Nexus, which between them give access to a wide variety of news archives, and some of these are named on the screen. If you're interested in the UK government publications and records, you can find materials going back to the 17th century, so the 1600s, on UK parliamentary papers. Public information online is also a useful source of information about government activities. As the name suggests, GALE Primary Sources provides access to primary source materials, including newspapers, for example The Times and The Independent, and the contents of the British Library newspapers collection. Specialist areas include crime, punishment and popular culture from 1790 to 1920, and the archives of sexuality and gender. Finally, in this section, Mass Observation Online gives us access to the archives of a massive sociological study which took place in the mid-20th century, not just to the data but also photographs, maps and manuscripts. That was just a few of the primary source archives the library has access to. To find more, it's a good idea to look at the subject guides. These guides are made by academic liaison librarians, and there is one for every subject. The History Subject Guide in particular has links to a wide variety of online primary source archives. You can access the guides from the library homepage by clicking on the link. The link will take you through to a list of guides. Click on the subject you want, and you will be linked to the subject guide. And here is the History Subject Guide showing the beginning of the list of digitised primary sources. As you can see, there are sources covering a wide range of topics, so this is a really good place to start looking for primary source content. Of course, it may well be that you need to look elsewhere when you're researching, so we'll have a quick look at how you might do that. Firstly, where might you find a collection? Special collections and archives have traditionally been kept in libraries or designated archives, although they can also be found in museums. Large organisations will probably have their own archives, and some individuals also have personal archives, which may be left to a library or a museum after their death. This happens quite often with writers. Nowadays, there is an increasing amount of archive content available online, either born digital or digitised. This has improved access to collections because it's now possible to view materials without needing to visit in person. There's also a number of online catalogues and finding tools available to help you in your search, and we'll look at 3 of those which apply to UK archives now. Archives Hub is a portal that allows you to search for materials across archives and collections, and will also give you some information about the locations where the archives in question are housed. Discovery is the search tool of the National Archives, and you can use that to search not only for materials held by the National Archives, which is based at Kew in London, but in other UK collections. And finally, more locally, AIM25 is a portal that covers content housed in archives in the London area, around or within the M25. Some of the biggest collections have materials available through open access online, and this includes national libraries such as the British Library or the National Library of Scotland. You do need to watch out though, because although most of the collections are free to search, there may be a charge to download content. These days, a lot of material is created solely online and doesn't exist in any readable form physically. Attempts are now being made to archive this material. 2 organisations that are grappling with the issue of archiving materials from the Internet are the Internet Archive, which is a non-profit organisation that tries to offer permanent access to historical digital collections, and Wayback Machine, which has been archiving web content since 1996 and has now archived over 300 billion web pages. In an area where content can be ephemeral and subject to frequent change, it's reassuring to know that efforts are being made to record and archive this content. Now we'll go through a few points about how you can plan your visit to an archive or special collection. First of all, you can use online catalogues and other finding tools to check the locations and contents of the archives. Normal practice is to identify what you would like to look at in advance. This will help you make better use of your time once you arrive at the archive. And always contact the archive staff to check the availability of materials and any terms of access. You're welcome to come and consult our collections. To find out more about the collections, visit the Special Collections webpage from the library homepage. On the webpage, you'll find information about the collections organised by subject on the tabs in the centre. There is some crossover between subjects, so you may find a collection on more than one tab. You can search for printed books in the regular library search from the library homepage, and other materials may be listed on Word documents or spreadsheets. If we have a list for a collection, it will be here on the tab with a description. At the side of the page, you can find any news and updates about access to the collections and any other news we might have. As I said, you can use the library search to find printed books from special collections. To save time when you search for the author, title or subject in the usual way. Then use the library filter and choose special collections and apply filters to narrow your search results to special collections books only. Now you've done all that and arrived at the archive, how do you proceed? When you're handling anything from an archive or special collection, you need to have clean hands. We ask you not to use hand sanitizer, as this usually has alcohol in it, and there is a risk that the sanitizer might damage materials, so please just wash your hands thoroughly before you start. You won't necessarily need to wear gloves, but we will advise you if that's the case. Food and drink are not allowed in the reading room, and any handwritten notes you take must be made in pencil to avoid the risk of ink getting on the collections. Obviously, also, you shouldn't write or make marks on any special collections materials. We have equipment available to support fragile books. If you're working on documents that have a number of loose sheets, maybe from a file, please take care that the pages don't get out of sequence. And if you find that a book or any other material or object from the collection is damaged or has missing pages, please inform a member of staff. So when you found a collection you want to look at, you can book an appointment by email on libline@essex.ac.uk. It's a good idea to check the reading room opening hours on the website. They may change from time to time. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions to ask, please email us. You can also follow the library on social media for news and updates.